Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Today we are going to tackle about the Commonwealth and the World War II in 1935 to 1945. Here we have our objectives. First is to evaluate the establishment of a democratic and republican government in the Philippines by the Americans, assessing its impact on Filipino self-governance and the transition to independence. Second is to analyze the leadership role of Manuel L. Quezon during the Commonwealth period, focusing on his ability to navigate internal challenges and external threats, particularly during the World War II. And lastly, examine the dynamics of a cooperation between Filipinos and Americans during World War II, exploring the factors that influenced their alliance and its significance in the context of Filipino history and national identity. So Manuel L. Quezon, in his inaugural speech, he said that in order to satisfy not only to the passing needs of an hour, but also exacting the demands of the future. Because during this time, the Commonwealth government was a transition government. It was a preparatory for granting independence. It was a period of adjustment and solving many problems that confronted the nation as it marched towards its goal of gaining independence from a foreign rule. So the problem, Manuel L. Quezon also faced a lot of problem. First, we have the national security. So the national security, President Quezon prioritized national security concerns in the face of potential threats from Japan expansionist goal in the region. So yes, Japan has expansionist goal in the region, and they would certainly include Philippines as an object of conquest, and United States would not be able to do anything because even when the World War II broke out, the United States was hesitant about joining it at first, and they were not prepared in defending the Philippines as their colony. So that is why President Franklin D. Roosevelt, for example, he believed that in order to avoid war with Japan, they should give the Philippines its independence. And Japan that time, it was a rising power and had defeated China and Russia in separate wars. So they also invaded China, Korea, Manchuria, and finally China. So the National Defense Law was enacted to establish a citizens' army and bolster the country's defense capabilities. Quezon pushed for the passage of the National Defense Law, which aimed to create a citizen composed of young trainees, which are 21-year-old group, and General Douglas MacArthur was appointed to lead the Philippine Army, and preparations were made to train pilots and build a mosquito fleet of small, agile boats to counter potential Japanese aggression. Now we have the Quezon's administration invested in military infrastructure and training to enhance Philippines' defense readiness. So recognizing the limitations in financing large naval vessels, Quezon's government focused on developing a more agile defense strategy, including investment in aviation and the training of Filipino pilot for air warfare. Because Filipino pilots were trained in air warfare in order to be prepared for possible wars. And aviation, moreover, was also considered because in modern wars, airplanes had become very important. Now we have the social problems. Agrarian problems in the Philippines during the Commonwealth period were rooted in exploitation dating back to the Spanish era, particularly concerning friar estates and landlord exploitation. So the exploitation of peasants and agrarian unrest had a deep historical roots, as we all know, with the issue of land ownership and landlord oppression persisting from Spanish colonial rule. Various uprisings such as those in Mindanao, Central, and Southern Luzon and the Visayas were fueled in grievances over oppressive conditions. The Sakdal Uprising of 1935, led by Benigno R. Ramos, highlighted the social discontent and demanded immediate independence, fighting against government corruption and the Tidings-McDuffie Act. Because during this time, ladies and gentlemen, amidst the poverty and ignorance, the masses during that time, they hoped for deliverance. So, because there was a presence of oppression, the peasants wanted to gain independence with immediate independence without having the Tidings-McDuffie Act. So lastly, The Quezon's policy of social justice aimed to address agrarian issues but faced challenges from powerful landlords and vested interest, ultimately resulting in its failure. So the Quezon acknowledged the need for social justice, attempted to implement reforms to improve the welfare of the rural population. However, the Friends of Manuel L. Quezon, resistance from the influential landlords and Quezon's own circle hindered the success of these efforts, leading to having failure of his social justice program. Now we have our economic problems. Economic problems during Quezon's administration included domination of the retail trade industry by the Chinese and foreign dominance in the Philippine foreign trade. Since the Spanish period, the retail trade industry had been dominated by the Chinese, while the foreign owners, including the Americans, Chinese, and Japanese, controlled the Philippine foreign trade, limiting the country's economic independence. So the free trade, para masulbadan ng problema, the free trade agreement between the Philippines and the United States in 1909 led to over-reliance on the Americans market, neglecting other foreign markets. So the free trade agreement allowed Philippine products to enter the American market duty-free, leading to an exclusive focus on this market and neglecting opportunities in other foreign markets, which affected the diversification in the Philippine economy. And Quezon's agreement with President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1937 aimed to address economic challenges by extending the Philippine-American free trade relations and allowing limited quantities of Philippine products to enter the United States without export duties. So in response to economic challenges, Quezon negotiated with Roosevelt to extend free trade relations, providing the Philippines with more time to adjust its economy before independence. And this agreement aimed to stimulate economic growth by expanding market and access for Philippine products. And lastly, we have other problems. Quezon addressed the language problem in the Philippines by advocating for the creation of a national language institute and proclaiming Tagalog as the basis of national language in 1937. So, recognizing the diversity of languages and dialects in the Philippines, Quezon took steps to establish a unified national language, leading to the proclamation of Tagalog as the basis of our national language, following the recommendation of the Institute National Language. And concerns over the increasing economic strength of the Japanese in Mindanao led Quezon to recommend passage of the Immigration Act in 1940, aimed at regulating immigration and protecting Philippine security. So Quezon sought to address economic influence of Japanese in Mindanao by passing legislation to control immigration, with the Immigration Act setting annual immigration quotas for each nation. I think it was 400. I think it was about like 400, quota of 500. So during this time, the Immigration Act of 1940 intended to safeguard the Philippine security. It was perceived by the Japanese as anti-Japanese and led to their denouncement of the law. Now we will move on to the achievements of the Commonwealth period. So during the Commonwealth period, 1935 to 1941, the Philippines experienced a significant progress in commerce, industry, transportation, communication, public welfare, and art and literature. So under Quezon's leadership, the Commonwealth government implemented policies that facilitated economic growth, improved the transportation and communication infrastructure, enhanced public welfare services, and promoted cultural development through support for art and literature. Improvement in the transportation and communication infrastructure included the encouragement of inter-island shipping, expansion of railways lines, and construction of airfields, making transportation more accessible and affordable. Quezon's administration invested in upgrading the transportation and communication networks, leading to increased connectivity between cities and principal towns, as well as improved access to telephones, wireless, and radio services. Economic policies include the establishment of the National Economic Council and reorganization of the National Development Company to protect consumers from exploitation and promote economic development. So the creation of a National Economic Council aimed to advise government on economic matters, while the reorganization of the government companies and the establishment of new ones, such as the National Food Products Corporation, it aimed to safeguard consumers and stimulate economic growth. So emphasis on public welfare was evident through the strengthening of agencies like the Bureau of Public Welfare and National Relief Administration, providing assistance to vulnerable groups and victims of natural calamities. So the government prioritized public welfare by enhancing the scope and efficiency of welfare agencies. So they offer a support to those in need, including the mentally ill, children from poor families, and the unemployed. And now we have the last. The government promoted arts and literature through contests, competitions, encouraging development of talent and cultural expression in Tagalog, English, and Spanish. So Quezon's administration fostered a cultural development by organizing literary contests and supporting artistic endeavors, leading to increased literary activities and the emergence of talented writers in the Philippines.
As a second reporter, I'll be discussing the tumultuous events surrounding the war in the Pacific during the early 1940s, particularly focusing on the Philippines' experience under Japanese occupation. So, first is the attack on Pearl Harbor. The catalyst for the Pacific War was undoubtedly the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, where the Japanese bombers caught the United States off guard on December 7, 1941. This attack not only shocked the American nation but also had dire consequences for the Philippines, confirming the fears of Filipino leaders like Claro M. Recto, who had long warned of Japan's threat to their security. Next is the occupation of Manila. So as the Japanese forces swept through the Pacific, the Philippines became a battleground. So Manila, the capital, was bombed mercilessly despite being declared an open city by General Douglas MacArthur. The Japanese occupation saw widespread destruction, with iconic buildings and institutions falling victim to bombing raids. The next topic would be the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. So here, the fall of Bataan and Corregidor mark a dark chapter in Philippine history. Despite the valiant efforts of Filipino and American soldiers, hunger, disease, and relentless enemy attacks took their toll. The infamous Death March remains a haunting reminder of the brutality endured by the prisoners of war. Next is the government reorganization. So, under Japanese occupation, the Philippine government underwent significant reorganization with puppet regimes installed to serve Japanese interests. The presence of Japanese advisors masked the true intentions of military control, while propaganda efforts aimed to win over the Filipino populace. So for the next topic is the educational policy of the Japanese. So here, the Japanese occupation brought about a shift in educational policy, emphasizing the cultural assimilation and vocational training. However, the realities of war hindered widespread enrollment, and many Filipinos remained skeptical of Japanese intentions. Next is the Second Republic. So the establishment of the Second Republic, headed by Jose P. Laurel, was a thinly veiled attempt to legitimize Japanese rule. So despite lofty promises of independence, The harsh realities of daily life under occupation, marked by scarcity and brutality, undermine any semblance of trust in the new regime. And for the last topic of my discussion is the guerrilla warfare. So, throughout the occupation, Filipino resistance remained steadfast, with guerrilla movements emerging across the archipelago. And these brave fighters operating in the shadows disrupted Japanese operations and provided crucial intelligence to Allied forces. And their resilience paved the way for General MacArthur's eventual return and the liberation of the Philippines. In conclusion, the war in the Pacific brought untold suffering to the Philippines, and yet, amidst the darkness, the spirit of resilience and defiance shone brightly. The Filipino people endured immense hardships under occupation but emerged stronger, united in their pursuit of freedom and justice.
The government and exile. Quezon's party left in Corridor in 1942. They were brought to Australia, and from there they took a boat to San Francisco and reached Washington, D.C. by train. Quezon reorganized the Commonwealth government in the U.S. with his cabinet, which is General Basilio Valdez as Secretary of National Defense, Manuel Nieto as Secretary of Agriculture and Commerce, Joaquin Elizalde as Resident Commissioner, Dr. Arturo Rotor as Executive Secretary, and Jaime Hernandez as Secretary of Finance. Due to war condition, the government thought that it is wise to extend Quezon's term of presidency. However, Quezon's state at that time, he was very sick, and because of that, on August 1, 1944, he died at Saranac Lake, New York City, and he was succeeded by Vice President Osmeña. The return of MacArthur. In 1944, the United States began its offensive against Japan, capturing several Pacific islands and winning naval battles. MacArthur decided to return to the Philippines, ordering naval, marine, and air forces to attack Japan. Manila and other locations were heavily bombed by American airplanes, and on October 20, American air and naval forces bombarded Japanese positions in Leyte, marking the beginning of the battle for Philippine liberation. MacArthur arrived in Lingayen, Pangasinan on January 9, 1945 as Japanese military forces weakened. The American army then sailed through central Luzon, reaching Manila and Allied prisoners of war by February 3, 1945. The American at the University of Santo Tomas was freed, and the American forces continued to advance through central Luzon. The Commonwealth re-established. After the liberation of Leyte from the Japanese, MacArthur re-established the Commonwealth on October 23, 1944, with Tacloban as the temporary capital. He served as military administrator until he handed over government to President Osmeña on February 27, 1945. And on July 4, MacArthur proclaimed the liberation of the Philippines from the Japanese. And in the end of war, after the Japanese were defeated in the Philippines, MacArthur proposed to bring the war to Japan itself. Bombers bombed Tokyo, Nagoya, and other Japanese cities, prompting President Truman to defend unconditional surrender. Initially, Japan refused, but after the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered unconditionally. And on September 2, 1945, Japan signed the surrender term on the battleship of USS Missouri of Tokyo Bay, marking the end of the Pacific War.
The next chapter is all about the Third Republic, 1946 to 1969. It was established right after the Second World War, which left the Philippines devastated and left behind a deeply wounded people psychologically and emotionally. So, in order for the Philippines to reconstruct itself, it had to accept a financial aid from the US. This American aid to the Philippines had three conditions that is tied along with it. So, firstly, parity rights to the Americans to exploit the country's natural resources. Second, the US military and naval bases on the Philippine territory. And third, a number of defense and trade arrangements favorable to the Americans. So the poverty caused by unproductive agriculture, the absence of real industrialization, the dependence on foreign loans and exports have became a recurring problem to every administration from Rojas, Quirino, Garcia, Magsaysay, and Macapagal, and Marcos. So conditions after the war. The the Second World War led destructions of farms, work animals, machineries, buildings, roads, bridges, and most importantly, thousands upon thousands of lives of Filipinos. So it left the, our country devastated. The heavy bombing of Manila by the Americans to clear the city of Japanese hideouts destroyed infrastructures needed for economic recovery. So, for months there was no production, there was a widespread of unemployment, and food was scarce, and thousands died because of various diseases. This this have been this became a challenge to the statesmanship of the current president at that time, President Sergio Osmeña. Philippine Civil Affairs Unit is an agency that was created by the American Army in the Philippines to extend um, aid to the suffering Filipino people, and it also pays the salary of the municipal officials and teachers, and also employed Filipino laborers in American military projects. So the American government also gave money to the Philippine government for the purchase of food stuff, medicine, clothes for the Filipinos. However, this money was to be paid back by the Philippine government in due time. In 1945, President Osmeña thought to reorganize the government in order to make the government responsive to the immediate needs of the Filipinos. So the executive departments was restored, and a new uh, department was created, the Department of Information. Osmeña spoke in parts that we shall reestablish in our country a social political system in which officials and employees are not the masters of the people but their servant. The Filipinos suffered much more than the Americans after the war, even though it was an American war. So the American government decided to extend financial aid to the Philippines. The Congress of the US appropriated $100 million after conducting a survey of the damage done by the Japanese and the Americans themselves. So this $100 million is to be used for operating expenses and the redemption of guerrilla notes issued during the war. American Army surplus materials with a sale value of 100 million pesos were given to the Philippine government. So the Philippines was given a loan of $60 million for the purpose of reconstruction. So parity rights to the Americans. On October 1945, the American Congress passed a bill into a law known as the Bell Trade Relations Act. So this Bell Trade Relations Act means the free trade relations between Philippines and the US up to 1954. After that, the Philippines products entering the US would be taxed by 5% each year until the full 100% in 1974. However, it had to amend the Constitution in order to grant the parity rights since it violated the Constitution of 1935. The Americans, like the Filipinos, would be given the right to dispose, exploit, develop, and utilize all agricultural, timber, and mineral lands in the Philippines. So this violated the 1935 Constitution, which provided that after the independence, only corporations of 60% was owned by the Filipinos were allowed to exploit, dispose, and utilize all natural resources of the country. So many patriotic Filipino objected, but majority of the people were hungry, sick, and helpless. So in order to get the financial aid from the US, um, an amendment to the Constitution was passed to allow the parity rights.
This juncture, we will talk about the Third Republic proclaimed. When Congress was convened by Osmania, Manuel Rojas proceeded to be the president of the Senate, and Rojas wanted to be the president of the Philippines. On the other hand, Osmania was not in a good health, and he wanted to retire, but the men around him convinced him to run for the presidency, and on April 23, 1946, Manuel Rojas was elected President of the Commonwealth and the first President of the Third Republic of the Philippines. On July 4, 1946, it was the date chosen by the Americans to grant the Philippines its independence by the United States President Harry Truman. Truman also said that the United States recognized the independence of the Philippines as a separate and self-governing nation. In the proclamation, President Truman said that the United States was withdrawing and surrendering all rights of possession, supervision, jurisdiction, control, or sovereignty now existing and exercised by the people of the Philippines. However, Manuel Rojas only stayed for 2 years in the office since he died on April 15, 1948 after his speech at Clark Air Base, Pampanga, where he promised the Filipino cooperation with United States in times of war, and as the threat of the looming Korean War, he granted the United States the control of the military and naval bases at Clark Air Base and Subic Bay Naval Base in exchange for military aid, since Rojas' main concern was for the national security. However, it was very ironic in the part that it was already proclaimed by the United States that the Philippines was an independent country and all the rights of control was presided on the state. However, they do have a strong hold on the military forces in the country. And after Manuel Rojas, the next president, Elpidio Quirino, were faced with the Hukbalhak problem. Now, what is this Hukbalhak? Hukbalhak, or the Hukbo ng Bayan laban sa Hapon, was founded early in 1942 as an anti-Japanese organization present in Central Luzon, and the Hooks made Central Luzon practically independent of the Japanese occupation. It were led by the intellectuals Pedro Abad Santos and the Lava brothers Vicente Jose and Jesus. Their supremo was Luis Tarok, a peasant leader. Hukbalhak played a vital role in Japanese occupation since their existence weakens the Japanese forces in the country. They got their firearms after the surrender of the Filipino-American troops in Batahan. After the war ended, they refused to surrender with the fear that their landlords, since Hukbalhak is a group of peasants, they're afraid that their boss or their landlords might hire armed men to kill them. And when Rojas, the current president at the time, failed to win over the Hawks onto his side, he declared the Hawks as a band of outlaws. In March 1948, he declared the Hukbalhak and its peasant organization, the Pambansang Kaisahan ng Mga Magbubukid, or the PKM, as illegal. The second president of the republic, which is Elpidio Quirino, is an economist and he believed in economic stability. This then occurred in his program on agricultural productivity and industrialization. He also stabilized the Philippine currency by setting up the Central Bank of the Philippines, or as we all know, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. And he also tried to win over the Hawks by sending his brother, a former judge, Antonio Quirino, for a talk or for a negotiation with the Supremo, or the leader of the Hawks, Tarok. And Tarok asked for this following: the scrapping of the Bill Trade Act, no trade with Japan, redistribution of large estates to peasants, release of all Huk prisoners, industrialization, and removal of U.S. bases in the Philippines. These terms given by Tarok was, you can see that his aims is also for the nationalistic approach, and also for the organization of the Hukbalhak. However, as the result of the talk, President Quirino proclaimed amnesty to all Hawk and PKM members. On the other hand, the Hawk promised to surrender their arms. However, Judge Quirino denied or he did not agree with the terms given by Tarok. This results on the failure of the amnesty, and the peace was short-lived, and it was continued with violence and problems in the country. In the result, Ramon Magsaysay, who is that time is the Secretary of the National Defense of Elpidio Quirino, he worked hard to solve the problems regarding the Hukbalhak, or the hukbo ng bayan laban sa mga Hapon. Ramon Magsaysay adopted strict measures which included organized and simultaneous raids by the armed forces and the police to arrest Huk leaders and supporters. And on October 18, 1950, the Huk Politburo fell into the hands of the military and police authorities. This we can see that Ramon Magsaysay successfully get the Huks under his control. With the help of American money, Magsaysay won the presidency in 1953, receiving a great majority of votes. Since he is also famous with the common people, he introduces the Kamayan, and he goes with the barangay to barangay to meet the common people. Magsaysay, besides his successful campaign against Huks, is remembered for his policy of honest government. During his term, no friends or relatives ever benefited from his position, and he also created extensive irrigation system. He introduced modern agricultural methods and approved the agricultural tenancy. We will delve into the Garcia and the Filipino First policy. Now, what is this Filipino First policy? This Filipino First policy, it means that the Filipinos will be the masters of their own lands. On November 1957, Garcia was elected as the president, and he anchored his program of government in austerity. Austerity means that it is severely simple policies. It is temperate spending, signifies work, more thrift, more productive investment, and more efficiency. Now, since Garcia introduced the first Filipino policies, or it is the policy that the Filipinos will be the masters in their own land, this policy was adopted for the reason that the Philippines became the paradise of the foreigners who had become in control of the Philippine business, trade, and commerce. These national policies also included, for the first time, the revival of Philippine culture through the arts and historical researches. Now, next we have the Macapagal and land reform. Diosdado Macapagal won the 1961 presidential election. Macapagal promised to solve the problem of unemployment and promote self-sufficiency in food production. His presidency was known for two things: the Land Reform Code and the change of Independence Day celebration. So he asked the Congress to approve his agricultural land reform code. Now, there are 6 provisions in the agricultural land reform code. We have to encourage the formation of family-sized farms as the basis of Philippine agriculture, to improve the status of poor farmers by freeing them from the practices of exorbitant rates of interest for loans, to encourage bigger productivity to increase the income of small farmers, to apply all labor laws to all irrespective of their status in life, and to provide land settlement program and a distributor of land, and to make poor farmers independent, self-reliant, and responsible citizens. He was also the first president to adopt the control policy imposed by the foreign banks. And through an executive order, Macapagal changed the celebration of Independence Day from July 4 to June 12 of every year. Now, the 4th of July then became or changed into the Friendship Day or the Republic Day. Macapagal also proposed an organization uniting Malay-based countries through Mapilindo. It is composed of Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia. It is also considered as a precursor of the ASEAN or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And lastly, we have the election of Marcos. Macapagal and Marcos belongs to one political party, which is the Liberal Party, and both of them keep an agreement, a political agreement. But then when Macapagal term was over and he refused to follow the agreement with Marcos, this makes Marcos left the Liberal Party and joined the Nacionalistas with the help of his wife Imelda Marcos, and Marcos easily won the election. Now, this Marcos programs in the government included production of more rice and the diversification of crops to attain self-sufficiency in food, implementation of land reform programs, community development to strengthen further our social, economic, and political base, and to link countries' islands of more than 7,000, he embarked on an unprecedented infrastructure program. Now, it is important to note that with the lack of budget, these sparse Marcos, or this resulted of Marcos to loan from the international banks or other international organization that focuses on finance. And he also tried to increase the agricultural production and intensified the counter-insurgency drive against the Communist Party and the New People's Army. And outside the foreign affairs was caught in the Cold War between the United States and the USSR, and this brokered with the problems in the country, the problems such as the massacre of peasants in Concepcion, Tarlac, the killing of the 30 members of Lapiang Malaya in Manila, the killing of the Muslim trainees in the famous Chabida massacre in Corregidor Island sent waves of shock into the population. It is very important to note that this topic that we have discussed focuses on the history of the Philippines, on the governance of the different president of the country. Other may focus on economic, and other may focus on agricultural and other programs, and this gives us the glimpse of different leadership and different approach towards the problems faced the people and the country throughout the years.